On my terrace, she lifted a mug and declared my villa belonged to her husband's parents, banning me from ever coming back. I had driven hours craving quiet by the lake, a widower who still folds shirts like inspection and speaks softly to Elizabeth's photo. She called it family duty and reputation, mocked my age, and twisted years of generosity into proof that I owed them everything. I swallowed the hurt and vowed to answer with records, witnesses, law, and calm, to take back my name and my home. What would you do? My name is Martin Hale, 62, a retired father with steady hands. I still fold my shirts like inspection, a small habit from quiet service years. The drive to the lake felt like a promise I could keep. Pines thinned, the stone path showed, and the villa looked calmly unchanged. Steam rose from 2 mugs on the terrace where white robes drifted. My daughter Kelly leaned on the rail while Palmer hovered behind her. Their faces set like a closed door before a word was spoken. I lifted my weekend bag and felt something tighten under my ribs. I kept my voice even and asked if they were staying long. Kelly said I should turn around because they had plans already. She said I should call first if I wanted to use anything. Palmer studied the tiles like the grout lines needed counting right then. I reminded her the deed carried my name and her mother's choosing. She answered with a smooth tone that sounded practiced and strangely distant. I said the drive was 2 hours and I needed the quiet. She said I was in the way, and the words landed heavy. I kept my hands still because anger makes them shake if hurried. I nodded once, swallowed hard, and stepped back from my own porch. The German engine started clean and louder than I expected in daylight. In the mirror, she lifted her mug like a small, satisfied toast. The highway unspooled while I counted lanes to keep my breathing steady. At home, the study smelled like paper, coffee, and old rain. I waited for a call that might sand down the afternoon's rough edge. When the phone rang, her voice carried business like a clipped memo. She announced the villa now belonged to Palmer's parents, and I was banned. I asked if she had lost her mind, then heard my chair creak. She called me selfish and said I barely used the place anymore. She said age made excess, and space should follow need, not sentiment. I listed weddings, tuition, the car, the deposit, and the silence afterward. She said fathers do that, then asked what I needed the house for. Something inside hardened, and I told her no with careful breath. She warned about travel plans and movers scheduled for Sunday morning already. We ended the call colder than before, and the room felt smaller. I sat with the window darkening and watched my reflection fade slowly. Later, I opened the laptop and searched statutes, transfers, and trusts carefully. The language was dry, but facts are anchors when feelings start drifting. I printed the deed and slid documents into labeled envelopes by date. I noted every call, every phrase, and every time my hands shook. Morning brought coffee, and a steadier pulse I could finally trust. I walked the block and counted steps until my breath evened out. On the desk, Elizabeth's photo caught light across the glass and frame. Her laugh lived there, and for a second the room warmed again. Grief had bent me, but it had also taught patience under pressure. I replayed the terrace and heard how her tone left no room. I replayed the phone call and heard how I finally said, no. I ran a finger along the deed and felt the paper's raised seal. My name held weight, even if my daughter treated it like mist. So I made a list and wrote numbers beside each next step. I set a file for counsel and a file for timelines today. I copied receipts that proved the years I kept saying yes. I opened a fresh pad and underlined the dates that mattered most. I thought about respect and how it leaves like heat from doors. I remembered folding shirts before dawn because order quiets stormy rooms inside. I cleaned the kitchen slowly and let the coffee machine hum like company. The phone pulsed with messages that stacked without openings for real answers. I read none of them because clarity prefers silence before action. Afternoon light turned the study wall softer, and my heart slowed down. I tested my voice and heard it come back steady and plain. If a boundary means anything, it must stand when love gets noisy. I looked again at Elizabeth and felt her steady my breathing from memory. Then I placed the deed on top of the stack and closed the folder. Sunday was their finish line, which meant I now had mine too. I would move on my schedule, not theirs, and not from fear. I would act with calm, even if my heart still knocked hard. And if family draws new lines, what value does my presence still hold? Tuesday started with a list, a black pen, and steady breath. I wrote boundaries first because rules mean little if they arrive last. I told myself to keep language simple and actions visible today. So I drafted 3 lines that any court would understand quickly. I will not fund new requests. I will not surrender property. I will not discuss under pressure. I copied the lines onto a card and slid it into my wallet. I turned off message previews so provocations could not break my focus. The phone buzzed anyway, and the first vibration felt like a test. Kelly sent a polite opener about logistics and respect and grown-up choices. I replied with a short note that asked for all requests in writing. She answered with a claim that family owed family when needs piled high. I sent my 3 lines again with dates and a calm sign-off. The screen flashed another paragraph about generosity and image and public perception. I placed the phone face down and logged each exchange with times. Documentation is boring, but it keeps memory honest when storms hit. I scanned the deed and printed fresh copies with clear margins for notes. I added a ledger page for calls and added a column for tone. It felt clinical, but clinical beats desperate when money and love mix. I showered, shaved, and tied my laces with the slow care learned long ago. The mirror showed a man who had stopped begging and started counting instead. At Marcus Chen's office, the hallway smelled like paper and quiet coffee steam. His assistant took the file, and he waved me in without ceremony. He asked for the history, the promises, the texts, and the timeline by day. I laid out receipts, tuition wires, repair bills, and the wedding check stubs. He listened like a builder reading soil, cautious and precise and thorough. He said my title was clean, and my records were stronger than average. He recommended steps that hardened boundaries without inviting friendly fire from courts. He listed a trust option, an LLC wrapper, and a charitable transfer. He reminded me to keep emotion out of signatures and keep dates aligned. He asked whether I had other keys in circulation or any open access. I said Kelly held a spare from the last storm season at the lake. He told me to change codes and update entry logs immediately after our meeting. He reminded me to keep each action modest so nothing looked like spite. Not this time. I said those words in my head while nodding once. He underlined the word notice and asked me to send 1 respectful letter. He drafted language that would travel well if read aloud under oath later. He asked about movers rumored for Sunday and whether trucks would arrive early. I said I believed they would, because urgency was part of their pressure. He said urgency does not create ownership, and smiled without warmth or malice. We set a follow-up for Thursday morning with notarized forms prepared and ready. I left the office with copies and a list marked in clean ink. On the sidewalk, I inhaled the harbor air and let the wind steady me. The phone buzzed again and landed heavier than it should on my nerves. Kelly sent a photo of her smiling beside Palmer in a bright kitchen. Her caption implied new beginnings and hinted at generosity flowing from older hands. I saved the image for the file and did not answer her message. Silence can be a boundary when noise tries to push through cracks. Back home, I placed a clean folder on my desk with simple labels. I changed the alarm code at the villa using the online panel still linked. I replaced the guest access code and logged the change in the ledger. I scheduled a locksmith inspection for Friday under my name and my card. I ordered new cylinders and a keypad unit that integrates with my system. I checked delivery windows and confirmed parts could arrive by Thursday noon. I arranged a notary visit for 2 key forms that Marcus recommended today. I stacked the envelopes by order of use and placed a clip on top. Afternoon light angled across my study and touched the frame on the shelf. Elizabeth's smile carried steadiness, not softness, and my breathing matched it. Grief had taught me how to sit through storms without throwing dishes. It had also taught me how slow rot looks like kindness on the surface. I recognized that pattern in every bright request that followed a long silence. so I wrote another line and taped it inside the folder's cover. Do not reward cruelty masked as need, even when the mask fits well. The phone buzzed with a cousin asking if I was feeling generous this month. I replied with a single sentence about privacy, legal review, and fair timing. The message ended the conversation, and I logged the exact minute and tone. In the garage, I found the spare lockbox and tested its battery level. I checked the emergency generator that powers cameras if the grid stumbles overnight. I laid tools on a towel and counted them like old kit before inspection. Order calms the mind when conflict tries to bait you into speed. I texted my neighbor Derek about a house question that needed quiet expertise. He loved systems and had helped several homes integrate new controls last winter. He asked if it was maintenance or design and whether I needed discretion. I wrote that I needed legal and psychological precision more than raw wattage. He asked for a time, and I suggested sunrise Thursday to avoid extra eyes. He sent a thumbs up and a checklist that looked like theater without actors yet. I smiled because planning is motion, even when wheels have not turned. At dinner, I ate slowly and kept the television off to hear myself think. I replayed the terrace scene with Kelly and listened to my first firm no. I replayed the phone call and heard how her tone used policy as cudgel. I replayed my calm and realized it came from finally having a plan. After dishes, I drove around the block and practiced a measured turn inward. The old routine from service still helps when adrenaline tries to own decisions. I parked, wrote a short letter of notice, and printed 2 clean copies. The letter said access was suspended while ownership protections were reviewed carefully. It used polite language and carried a date and my full name beneath. I sealed 1 copy for certified mail and scanned the other into the file. I slept lightly but without rage and woke before dawn to quiet streets. Wednesday opened with a bank visit and signature verification for 2 upcoming transfers. The clerk matched my license and stamped the card with a crisp sound. I asked for a cashier's check to fund fees without card disputes later. I placed the receipt under a paperclip in folder 2 by sequence. On the steps outside, I saw Kelly's name light the screen again insistently. She wrote that Palmer's parents had packed and would tour the villa Saturday. She wrote that time was short and Grace would look good on me again. I copied the message, archived it, and did not reward the bait or timeline. No more. That line stayed in my head like a firm post driven deep. I drove by a hardware supplier and picked up signage supplies and mounting screws. The clerk asked about weather ratings, and I said I wanted durable and clear. I added 2 tamper-resistant brackets because warnings matter even when ignored. Back in the study, I built a small schedule block by block and hour. The plan assigned each step a place, so panic could not fill gaps. Midday brought Marcus's call about phrasing for a potential charitable conveyance. He said the option remained prudent if escalation made ownership too fragile socially. He explained how donor use can remain while title serves a public good. I remembered a brochure Elizabeth kept about a shelter that needed stable funds. The image of folded cots returned, and something settled behind my ribs. I told him to draft both paths, so choice stayed mine until execution. He agreed, and reminded me to move only when benefits outran costs clearly. Afternoon brought a message from Palmer that rehearsed the language of sacrifice. He wrote about duty and hardship, and parents who had given him everything. He wrote that housing them would prove I understood family before pride. I answered with 1 sentence that said, no, and left no angle open. He fired back with lines about reputation and community perception and mutual friends. I logged the threats under a calm heading so they lived where they belonged. That evening, I walked the neighborhood and counted breaths between the streetlights again. Rhythm returned, and my shoulders lost the lift they had carried for days. I stopped at Derek's porch and handed him a folder with basic drawings. He scanned the pages and asked whether the guests would arrive by daylight. I said Sunday morning seemed likely, and he nodded like a conductor hearing tempo. He asked about non-lethal, non-contact methods that persuade without breaking any statute. I said I wanted dignity first and lawfulness second that still felt firm. He said those 2 could be the same thing if design carried discipline. We agreed to meet at dawn in my garage with coffee and quiet tools. He left with a list that included sensors, speakers, backups, and minimal footprints. I went home, set my alarm, and laid out work clothes by habit. The house felt different now, not warmer, but steadier beneath each footstep. Thursday rose pink and early, and I brewed coffee before the alarm finished. Derek rolled up with cases and a grin that belonged to a tinkerer. He asked how far I wanted to go, and I said far enough. He asked if I wanted any signatures inside the system for later proof. I said I wanted control, records, and a way to stand down quickly. He said he could build a layered response that respected the law and physics. We set the cases on the workbench and opened them like careful surgeons. I checked the ledger, circled Sunday, and wrote the word commencement beside it. The plan was now a sequence with tools, notices, codes, and a timeline. The last light faded from the garage as we loaded the truck in silence. We closed the tailgate and listened to the latch click with a clean sound. Then I locked the house, checked the folder, and set the coffee thermos down. We climbed into the cab, turned the key, and faced the road north. Derek and I reached the villa before noon and moved like a crew that had rehearsed in silence. Cases laid out on the entry tiles while I checked the ledger and circled Sunday again with a firm hand. Then he mapped sensor lines with painter's tape, and I measured speaker spacing with a carpenter's eye so nothing felt obvious. And we kept our voices low because calm work sets the tone better than any speech could. Inside, we placed motion eyes high in corners, tucked slim speakers near vents, hid a small projector behind books, and slid a backup battery into a panel cavity that looked built for it. Then we walked each room with the tablet and built layered responses that started polite and climbed to firm, and we left a clear warning placard at the front door because notice matters, even when tempers don't. We ran drills like a light infantry exercise without boots or dust, cadence steady, triggers clean, and I felt that old training settle my breathing as my finger hovered over the app's master toggle, because patience under pressure still wins more fights than noise. We tested once and watched the house wake into a controlled storm. Then we shut it down and logged times, volumes, and thresholds. And when Derek finally packed the last case, he asked if I wanted remote access on a dedicated device, so I linked it to my phone and a spare, then locked both inside the desk until the moment truly required them. On Sunday afternoon, I took my place in the study with 3 screens bright and a notepad open for timestamps, coffee warm on the coaster, and the blinds half drawn to keep the room steady. And at 2:28, the driveway camera caught a blue van swinging wide as if it already knew the turn. Kelly stepped out first with her weekend confidence. Palmer helped Margaret and Carl lift suitcases that looked heavy with entitlement, and they paused at the door long enough to tear the placard free before stepping over the screws like they were kicking stray gravel. Then they went inside, while the entry sensor blinked and the house readied itself, and I did nothing for a beat, because I wanted their certainty to ripen into full claim before I pressed start. I let them wander, watched them point, watched them place a box on the console and a tote on the couch, watched Palmer pocket a key, while Kelly traced a finger along the banister as if naming the wood made it hers. Then I placed my finger on the screen and thought of Elizabeth, steadied my chest, and tapped the icon once with a clean motion that felt like closing a gate. The living room blinked into bright patterns that disoriented the camera slightly. The entry announced trespass in a clear, even voice. The kitchen faucets opened to a steady rush that sounded like rain across tile, and the hallway filled with faint footfalls and whispers that came from nowhere you could point to. Then motion triggered the projectors, and the walls found shadows that moved from corners. The eye usually trusts, and within seconds every person inside shifted from sure to uncertain, from brisk to rattled. Palmer moved toward the breaker, but stopped when the lock delay engaged. Kelly raised her hands like she could push sound away. Margaret grabbed Carl's sleeve and started pleading in a voice that trembled more than it carried. And the house stayed lawful while growing stricter every 30 seconds they refused to leave. I watched the bathroom lights strobe and settle into a pattern designed to unsettle. Then I watched palms slap switches that did nothing because the backup held. And I wrote timestamps while my heart pounded in a rhythm I could still control. Eventually, panic outran pride, and all four clustered near the door like sailboats crowded by a sudden squall. Then the delay released, and they stumbled into daylight with faces drained of color, and the van's sliding door slammed before the engine caught, and I sat back and let the quiet reclaim the study, while the house reset to stillness with a soft chime. 15 minutes later, my phone lit with Kelly's name and a storm of accusations that leapt from disbelief to certainty to blame. She said the place was haunted or rigged or criminal. She said I had engineered pain and humiliation. She said the police were coming and that truth would finally have a badge. And I answered with a slow cadence that offered concern and asked for details. Then I said I had been home all night, and that systems sometimes fail in ways that feel personal when tempers run high, and I let the call end on her promise to prove everything in daylight. The officers arrived at 6, their flashlights playing over hinges and panels, and I watched through the feed as they walked the rooms like men who have seen worse and expected less. Then they found nothing illegal, only modern hardware and a warning removed from the door. They wrote something on a pad and advised caution, and by 7, the van pulled away, with 4 silent passengers who stared straight ahead, like they were leaving a cemetery they had never meant to enter. The study went quiet again, and I opened a new page labeled Monday, because momentum belongs to whoever writes first. On Monday morning, a locksmith truck rolled into the drive, and a tech in a gray shirt took one look at the integrated deadbolts and shook his head. Before trying anyway, he probed the keypad, he tried a cylinder swap, he returned to the van for a different kit. He called someone and described a network that lived behind the panel with redundancy and logs. Then he told Palmer he could replace a door, but not a system tied to secure backups without owner authorization. And Palmer answered with impatience that made his shoulders square before they slumped when the quote arrived, and the truck left with its ladder rattling like a closing thought. That evening, the knock at my door came hard and rehearsed. Kelly stood on the step with eyes that demanded a surrender. Palmer crossed his arms like he had practiced in a mirror, and behind them, the air carried the smell of anger that has nowhere useful to go. They spoke about reputation, gratitude, and blood. They spoke about what the community might say if I kept refusing, and they spoke about love in the same breath as leverage. Then they warned they could do more than I thought, and that I was choosing distance over family, and I kept my posture quiet and repeated my 3 lines with steady breath, while I let their words pass like weather. When the door closed, I called Marcus and scheduled Wednesday at 10 with full documentation. Then I called Bradley, our longtime notary, and asked for a room, a witness, and clean paper ready. And Tuesday I met with Marcus again and signed preliminary notices that clarified access. Then I carried a sealed envelope home and placed it beside Elizabeth's photo because the next piece required more than anger. It required clarity about what could stand in public light without cracking. On Wednesday morning, the conference room smelled like legal pads and warm toner. Bradley had arranged chairs and set out a neat stack of forms, and when Kelly and Palmer entered with Margaret and Carl trailing, the air changed from aggressive to brittle. They spoke first about compromise that looked like surrender. Then they asked for an immediate transfer and an apology that tasted like admission, and Bradley nodded as if to say he had heard. Then he turned to me and asked if I was ready to proceed, and I said I was ready to finalize what we had prepared on Monday. Marcus explained that title allows a lawful donor to convey property to a charitable foundation with a reserved life estate for personal use. He explained that the transfer served a public good while protecting ongoing occupancy, and he explained that the deed had been filed and recorded with all signatures notarized 2 days ago. Then he slid copies across the table and pointed to dates as if reading a clock, and I watched Kelly read the line where my villa became a shelter's resource, while my right to visit and maintain remained intact for life. The room went very quiet for several seconds, that felt longer than months. Then Palmer asked if this was a trick that could be undone by a different lawyer. Margaret asked where they would go now that their lease was ending soon. Carl asked if any part of the plan could bend because of family history, and Marcus answered like a carpenter checking load paths, saying the structure stood as signed, the record held, the notice was ample, and the decision was lawful and permanent. Then Bradley notarized acknowledgments in calm strokes that sounded like a small metronome marking time. Kelly looked at me with a rage that tried to hide shock. She said I had planned a cruelty and dressed it as charity. She said Elizabeth would be ashamed of a father who chose strangers over blood. And I felt a heat rise and fall as I answered with a steady rhythm that noted I had chosen boundaries and a public good over coercion, and that love without respect had already taken too much. Then I folded my copy and stood, and the paper felt heavier than it looked because it carried 30 years of work and 3 years of grief set into order. Outside, the wind off the harbor made flags pull tight on their lines, the kind of wind that tells small boats to check their knots. And I thought about how a story changes when the paperwork exists, and the dates line up, and the words have witnesses. Then I walked to the curb and let the morning noise drown the last echoes of the conference room, and my phone buzzed 3 times with messages that stacked. But I waited because reacting quickly is how I lost ground before. That afternoon, I drove to the villa with a box for the remaining devices. I removed the projectors and tucked the sensors into foam. I labeled the cables and reset the app to manual only, and the house grew simple again. Just light through glass and wind across water and the faint smell of cedar in the hall. Then I stood on the terrace and let the lake quiet my chest while I reviewed the ledger and drew a line beneath Wednesday with a note that said, "Public truth established, leverage neutralized, access secured," and I wrote those words carefully so I would remember that the work was real. Sunset found me driving home with the road unwinding like a long exhale, the dashboard clock steady, the phone silent for a rare hour, and I thought about what comes after a clean victory that still aches, because winning in public rarely heals in private right away. Then I parked, turned off the engine, and sat for a minute with my hands on the wheel, feeling both lighter and more alone than I expected. The next morning began with a message from an old friend who had heard a version of events already circulating. He asked if I was all right, and whether the talk was fair, and I answered with a short truth that said I was fine, and that rumors would find less oxygen once the facts met daylight. Then I put down the phone and made coffee because small rituals hold a day together when families pull apart at the seams. So the villa stood under a new title and an old right. The police report logged nothing illegal. The notary stamped the day into a record that would outlast our tempers. And my name remained where it needed to be, while the foundation gained what it needed to do good. Yet I knew victories like that send ripples into places you cannot manage or predict, and I could already feel the next wave forming. What price will this clean outcome demand from a father who still hopes for a daughter's respect? The morning after the conference room felt oddly quiet, the kind of quiet that tests whether a choice holds under normal light. And I made coffee, opened the ledger, and wrote 2 lines that mattered more than any speech: public truth established and boundaries remain. Then I walked the block and nodded at a neighbor who paused, as if news had already drifted beneath doors. He asked if everything was all right because he had heard something vague about family, money, and property. And I said I was fine, and that paperwork now spoke for itself. Then he tried a second question about whether Kelly might be angry for a while, and I said anger sometimes keeps people warm until they remember a better heat. So he shrugged, wished me a good day, and the rumor machine moved on without finding fresh fuel. Before noon, an old friend forwarded a screenshot that turned my stomach for a moment, a post from someone in Palmer's circle that called me controlling and unkind, and I stared at the words until they lost temperature. Then I saved the image into the file marked noise, because a record without panic still helps, and I returned to real tasks like settling the utility autopay to the foundation account, and sending a small note to their director confirming the maintenance schedule I would cover personally. By afternoon, the phone held a message from Palmer that tried a different angle. He spoke about pressure and timelines and how leases end without mercy. He said they had counted on a solution that now belonged to strangers, and he used the word betrayal twice, as if repetition might harden it into law. Then he suggested a compromise where I would grant temporary use if everyone stayed civil. And I listened once before deleting, because civility without respect is just a softer tool. And I wrote a calm line in the ledger that read, "Request reframed as emergency declined." An hour later, Margaret called and left a quiet voicemail that did not ask for keys or time or rooms. It simply said they were scared and had misjudged the ground they stood on. and I sat with that for a minute because fear makes people do messy math. Then I saved the audio into the file and felt something complicated and human settle under my ribs where pure anger had lived for weeks. That evening, I drove to the lake with Derek's cases already returned and thanked him on the porch for keeping our work precise and within bounds. He laughed like a man who loves puzzles more than drama and said the true trick had never been the tech. It had been the patience to use it gently. Then he waved and disappeared inside, and I kept driving because I wanted to see the water again, free of equipment and alarms. The villa opened like a room finally aired, and I walked it slowly with bare hands, touching wood and stone and glass without thinking about systems or sequences. And the house felt like a place again, not a strategy, so I brewed coffee and took it to the terrace where the lake caught the last light, and made a simple promise that I whispered only to myself: no more wars inside these walls. Back home, I found a message from Kelly sitting like a stone on the screen. She proposed a meeting at a diner near the freeway, where the booths listen and the coffee refills automatically, and I stared at the words long enough to separate instinct from judgment. Then I wrote 3 conditions that fit on one line: public place, no demands, no money talk, and she replied with a single yes that carried the weight of someone trying not to blink. The next day, I arrived first and chose a booth with a view of the door because I needed an easy breath when the bell chimed. And when she walked in, I noticed how the air around her had lost some performance and gained a tired edge. We sat. A server poured coffee, and for a minute we just held mugs, like strangers learning small weather again. Then she began with a careful apology that kept stepping around sharp corners. She said she had been under pressure and felt alone, and believed I would understand without conditions, because family always had before. And I listened without flinching while I let memory sort truth from posture. I told her I heard the pressure, but could not accept the method that tried to turn love into leverage. And I said the villa's title was not a punishment, but a promise redirected. Then I reached into the folder and slid a single page across the table, because I needed one last seed to open in daylight. It was the letter from the foundation confirming the designation of a small fund that would carry Elizabeth's name above the porch, where the morning sun hits first. And Kelly read the name and stopped talking like a sudden brake had gripped a wheel. Then she asked if this had been the plan from the start, or just a shield thrown at the last minute to make me look merciful. And I said the idea had returned when I found her old brochure in my desk, and I realized I could honor both memory and boundary in one move that would still let me sit with the water when the day required it. She looked at the page for a long time and then said something that was both harsher and more honest than anything she had offered this year. She said she had felt small after Mom died and needed a ladder that money could build fast. She said Palmer's parents had whispered that I would never say no because grief makes easy targets. And she said calling me old and alone had felt like a weapon that worked until it didn't. Then she asked whether there was any road back that did not include a check or a key, and the question felt like a door cracked rather than slammed, even if the hallway beyond remained dark. I told her the only road I could walk now had 3 mile markers: respect, responsibility, repair, and I explained that respect meant speaking to me like a person even when I disagreed. Responsibility meant carrying her own weight and letting Palmer carry his, and repair meant something tangible that healed what was damaged rather than painted it. Then I suggested she spend a few weekends volunteering at the lake shelter under the name on that letter, because seeing how homes become lifelines can change the shape of want, and I said I would meet for coffee again if she wanted to talk about how it felt, rather than what it paid. She nodded once and twice, and then looked out the window as if she could find an easier version of me walking across the lot. The server refilled our cups and asked about pie, and we both said, "Not today," at the same time, which would have been funny last year, and she wrapped the letter carefully and slid it back, then asked whether Palmer could apologize directly, or if I preferred distance for a while, and I told her apologies are smaller than actions but welcome when they arrive without a price. So she said she would try to untangle a few expectations at home, and I said I hoped she would, and for a brief moment we sat inside, a silence that did not feel like war. Days after the diner, small shockwaves kept finding shore in predictable places. A cousin texted a line about family being complicated and left it there. A client asked whether I was selling other properties, and I said, "No." The foundation's director emailed a simple thank you with a maintenance checklist I gladly accepted. And Margaret sent a short note that said they had found a month-to-month sublet and would manage the rest without my involvement. Then Carl left a folded apology on my porch that admitted he had allowed Hope to flatten ethics in his head, and I tucked the paper into the file and wished them a steadier season, because wishing costs nothing, and sometimes helps. The hardest part arrived in quieter hours, when I washed a single cup or set one plate on the counter and the room echoed with the life we used to hold. That is when the price of victory shows its receipt, because boundaries protect, but they also reveal how empty a house can feel when a voice is missing. So I turned those moments into simple tasks that kept me facing forward. I walked the neighborhood at dusk and waved at the same porch swing. I fixed a loose hinge in the hallway and oiled 2 door latches that had begun to complain. And I called the shelter to ask whether they needed a Saturday handyman, because small work mends large breaks over time. One evening, Kelly sent a message that felt different from all the others. It was short and without posture. She had volunteered that day to sort donations and had spent 2 hours folding blankets and listening to a woman explain how a stable bed changes the way a person thinks about tomorrow, and she said she had not understood that truth before the conference room and the diner and the letter. Then she asked if I would join her next weekend for an hour, not to talk about the villa or money or contracts, just to do small work side by side, and I stared at the screen for a long beat because the ask held no strings. Then I typed that I would meet her at the back door, where the cots lean and the light hangs, warm and quiet. That night I drove to the lake and stood on the terrace where the rail still fits my palms. The water held a thin moon, and a breeze came off the surface soft as an answer I hadn't expected. I thought about how leverage had become language in our house, and how replacing it with work might teach us both a steadier grammar. Then I wrote 2 words in the ledger, under a clean date, conditional yes, and I closed the book because some decisions should live in muscle before they live on paper. The following week brought fewer messages and more simple days, and I let that rhythm do its repair. Because not every wound needs a speech to heal, I returned Derek's last adapter with a thank you note and a gift card tucked inside, because kindness deserves a closing frame, and I sent Marcus a short update that said there was no litigation on the horizon and that the record had done its work. Then I ran my hand across the clean desk and felt a strange lightness, grief still present, anger cooling, hope careful but awake. I know peace is not permanent, and stories like ours rarely fix in one scene. A misstep will come, a hard word will slip, and pressure will try to sell a shortcut again. Yet the house stands on firmer ground now, and the paper trail shines like a line I can follow when the room gets loud, so I will keep my pace, meet for coffee when the tone is right, do my hours at the shelter, and check the porch for notes that mean something real. Because if there is a road back, it will be built from small pieces carried by both of us, not from keys or checks passed across a table. And when the next test arrives, as it always does in families, will we both choose the slower path that repairs instead of the quick one that burns? I arrived early at the shelter on a Saturday that smelled like soap and coffee, carried a toolbox in one hand and a roll of blue tape in the other, and the volunteer door opened to stacked cots and a hallway humming with quiet purpose as Kelly waved me in with a small, uncertain smile that did not ask for anything. We started with blankets and moved to a sticking hinge by the laundry room, and the director showed me the porch where the morning sun hits first, the same place where Elizabeth's name would rest on a simple plaque that asks for care more than attention. Kelly folded in a steady rhythm while I set the hinge and tested the swing. Then we traded places without notes, because working side by side leaves less space for old scripts to take over. A woman thanked us for fixing the door that used to squeal, and Kelly nodded with wet eyes she tried to hide by reaching for another stack, and I handed her fresh tape like it was a language we both remembered from better years. We ate granola bars on the back steps where the air felt honest, watching a delivery van bring 7 boxes of sheets, and she said she might come Tuesdays after work if the schedule allowed. So I said I would be there some Saturdays and maybe a Wednesday if a stubborn repair needed 2 hands. In the weeks that followed, small routines grew where pressure had once lived. I logged my hours, checked the energy bill, swept the porch before the first arrival, and left before the last story of the day could turn me into a hero I had no right to be. Kelly's messages became simple and spare: weather and work, and whether the shelter needed more laundry soap, and I kept my replies short and open, because trust breathes better in uncluttered rooms than crowded ones. Palmer sent a brief note that read more like penance than performance. He said he had confused urgency with entitlement and would keep his distance while he learned the difference, and I filed it under repair, because apologies deserve a place that is not the trash. Margaret mailed a thank you for the month-to-month sublet they had found near the bus line, and Carl enclosed a list of handyman jobs he had finally taken instead of waiting for a windfall, and I felt a knot loosen where resentment had built a knotty house. At the villa, I planted 2 young maples beyond the terrace, because trees do slow work without asking for applause, and I replaced a cracked tile near the entry with one from the box Elizabeth insisted we keep for exactly this purpose. Then I stood at the rail while fog lifted and found the lake again, as if forgiveness were a shapewater knows by muscle memory. Derek came by for his last adapter and stayed long enough to drink coffee that had cooled to a comfortable quiet, and he asked if I planned more systems, so I said no. The house could be a house now, and he grinned like a man pleased by a puzzle solved and not repeated. Marcus called to close the file and asked whether I needed anything else, and I thanked him for drafting language that carried facts without acid. Then I set the folder in the cabinet where finished storms sleep, labeled and dull and useful only if thunder returns. Bradley sent a holiday card with a photo of his new grandchild sleeping against a shoulder, and I put it on the shelf beside Elizabeth's picture, because some shelves should hold proof that families can bend without breaking every time. I kept the ledger, but wrote less inside it. Occasional lines about maintenance and coffee with my neighbor, and 2 hours at the shelter on a windy weekend. And one small entry that said, Kelly laughed today when a kid asked if folding blankets earns badges. Then she showed him how to roll tight corners like a game. On a clear afternoon, the foundation hosted a small gathering for donors and regulars. Nothing loud, just lemonade in paper cups, and a few words about beds that turn nights into mornings, and the director unveiled the plaque with Elizabeth's name and a short line about welcome. And I traced the letters with a finger, because touch makes memory hold still. Kelly stood beside me and did not speak, which felt exactly right. And when the group clapped softly, I stepped back so the porch could belong to the people who needed it most. And later, I found a quiet corner and wrote a single sentence on a small card I left by the sign. Thank you for teaching me that love without boundaries is not love. Afterward, we walked to the parking lot without choreography, and she asked if I wanted to try coffee next week without an agenda, and I said yes, and meant it. Then we stood at our car doors like actors who have finally forgotten their old lines, and do not miss them. The rumor mill collapsed from boredom when it could not find heat. Clients stopped asking about sales because none were coming, and my inbox went back to receipts and reminders and an occasional joke from an old foreman who still believes the right wrench can fix almost anything. Evenings changed shape. I cooked simple meals and ate at the table instead of the sink. I read pages aloud to hear whether my voice still belonged to me, and I walked the block after sunset just long enough to see porch lights flick on without thinking about alarms. Some nights were heavy anyway, because quiet can weigh more than noise when a chair stays empty, and on those nights I cleaned the kitchen slowly and laid out tomorrow's list. Then I stood by the window and let the streetlight make a soft square on the floor while I told the room that dignity is not stiffness. It is simply standing where your name belongs. Holidays arrived without drama, smaller than before but warmer in places that used to feel cold, and Kelly stopped by with a pie she had baked from a worn recipe card that carried Elizabeth's notes in the margins, and we ate slices on the terrace and let the lake do most of the speaking, while a new map of our family drew itself with fewer roads and clearer lines. We took a photo by the rail not for posting, but for proof, and when she left, she touched the doorframe like a person who has learned a house is not a prize, but a loan you honor with care. And I watched her taillights until they turned at the mailbox and disappeared into the ordinary dark. Weeks later, I returned to the shelter to rehang a door that had sagged under good use. The screws bit, the wood settled, and the latch clicked with that clean sound I have always loved. Then I stepped onto the porch and read Elizabeth's name again, because rituals keep promises alive. I know there will be stumbles, because people do not change on a schedule. A sharp word will find its way in. An old bruise will ache. And some days I will miss the version of family we never were but grieved anyway. Yet the house stands, the paper holds, my temper is not the boss, and our road, narrow, careful, patient, moves forward just enough. I used to think peace would arrive when everyone agreed with me, or returned what they took. Now I think peace is a daily habit of small, honest acts that leave room for respect to grow. So I will keep showing up where my hands help and my name fits. I will keep drinking coffee that cools while conversations warm at their own pace, and I will keep the ledger open to write only what deserves ink. If you were here, you would see nothing grand, just a man at a rail, a daughter learning new steps, and a house that is finally only a home again. And that is enough.